We come now to Appendix 4 of the Daniel 11 hypothesis, and these are updated as needed. Here we'll be covering verses 16 through 19, which describe the League of Nations that came into being after World War I, being then replaced in 1945 by the United Nations, which is the great horn of the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, verse 8, as well as the one who sends a raiser of taxes in Daniel chapter 11, verse 20. That word destroyed being the same word in the Hebrew as broken in Daniel chapter 8, verse 8. So with the word of wisdom from our Father in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, Daniel chapter 11, verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which is obviously the land of Israel, which by his hand shall be consumed. And it was Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, along with the Balfour Declaration, that paved the way for the fig tree generation to begin in 1948, with Kenite occupied Israel coming into being, which lines up with the first seal of Revelation chapter 6 as far as the build-up to Satan's appearance as Antichrist goes, with that cheap fabric imitation bow, and the word toxon in the Greek is from the base of 5088 in your Strong's Concordance, which means to produce from seed, as in the serpent seed, setting the stage for that old serpent called the devil and Satan to appear in Jerusalem as the false Christ at 666. And for that to happen, Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations had to happen first at the end of World War I, which is the starting point of Daniel chapter 11. The history of globalism, you could even call it, in as much as it goes all the way from the First World War and the first real step toward a one-world government with the League of Nations, all the way to the 5-month-long hour of temptation from Daniel chapter 11 verse 21 through 30 for the first half hour, and then Daniel 11:31 is where Satan appears as Antichrist, with Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 through 45 being at the end of the 5 months when the true Christ returns at the seventh trumpet. So going back to the League of Nations in Daniel 11 verse 17, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. Again, the British mandate brought about by the Balfour Declaration, and he shall give him the daughter of women, which is Jerusalem, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him, because obviously the League of Nations was just a precursor to the United Nations, which is also a precursor to the so-called New World Order, which is the global political system of Revelation 13. After this shall he, the League of Nations, turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, absorbing many countries into itself throughout the years, up until World War II was started by the second king of the South, which was Germany, the notable horn, not the great horn, but the notable horn of the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. The he-goat being symbolic of the shadow government of the Kenites, and the notable horn, not the great horn, but the notable horn, is Germany in the world wars. In this case, World War II, and the prince for his own behalf is the second king of the South, which is Germany, the prince for his own behalf that shall cause the reproach offered by the League of Nations to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. And the result of World War II was obviously the United Nations, which lines up with the second seal, with the wars Christ spoke of in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 being the world wars that brought about the United Nations, which we'll see in Daniel 11:20. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, and the covenant of the League of Nations originated in the Paris Peace Conference, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. And look at what happened in World War II to France, which showed the world what a failure the League of Nations was, but it did provide the skeletal structure for the next attempt at a global government, the United Nations. And the Paris Climate Accord is what begins the time frame here, because that's when the United Nations became the one who sends a raiser of taxes, to correctly translate Daniel 11:20, for the glory of the kingdom, according to the Interlinear Bible. And the Paris Climate Agreement went into effect in November of 2016, a global carbon tax being the ultimate eventuality if it weren't stopped. But November of 2020 is when the nations signed up for it can officially opt out. But within few days, which can even mean years in the book of Daniel, he shall be destroyed. The United Nations, that is to say, neither in anger nor in battle. And again, destroyed is the same word in the Hebrew as broken in Daniel chapter 8, verse 8. Nation shall rise against nation, as Christ says in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, which means the Kenite nation shall rise against the Kenite nation to break the great horn of the he-goat, which is the United Nations, after which the four beasts of Daniel 7 emerge at the woe of the fifth trumpet, which is the one world political system written of in Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through 30. Then after the deadly wound, which is what kingdom against kingdom means, Satan appears as Antichrist at the woe of the sixth trumpet, which starts at Daniel 11:31, which marks the midst of Daniel's 70th week, which was 7 years, but as we know from Revelation chapter 9, those 7 years were shortened to a 5-month period. Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 11 cover Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through 30, and then Revelation chapter 9, verse 13 is when Satan appears as Antichrist, as you can also see in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, the woe of the sixth trumpet ending when the true Christ returns at the woe of the seventh trumpet, which you can read of in Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 45. So when you hear of wars, which means the world wars, and rumors of wars, which is the Cold War and beyond, all the way up to now, be ye not troubled, for the end is not yet. Nation shall rise against nation, meaning the goat fig nation shall rise up against the goat fig nation to break the great horn, which is the United Nations, after which the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins, and immediately after the tribulation of those days, the true Christ returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords at the seventh trumpet.